My name's Owen Daggett. I'm a principal consultant at Turner and Townsend, and today we're joined by Dr. Sarah Price from Coda Consulting, based down in Bristol. Today we're focusing on PAS 2035 and the plan changes to PAS 2035. And I'm sure many of you are still getting your heads around the basics of PAS 2035, and they're now introducing some proposed changes, so there's even more to get your head around, which is why we're bringing our expert Sarah into the meeting today to help get some of these points across.
Thank you, Owen. I'm going to give you quite a comprehensive review of the changes in PAS 2035. There's a lot in here. Don't worry if you don't get all of the details down today, but hopefully it'll give you a pointer in the right direction as to which bits of PAS 2035 to go and have a look at that have changed. I wanted to start with the objectives of PAS 2035 and PAS 2030 updates. To give you an idea of the kinds of things that the retrofit steering task group are looking to improve in PAS 2035, or have improved. And it also gives us a bit of an indication as to why we had PAS 2035 in the first place. It's always good to remind ourselves of that. PAS 2035 came out of a recommendation from the Each Home Counts review, which was some 10 years ago now, into the state of domestic retrofit in the UK. The retrofit steering task group was set up, and they came up with this standard on doing domestic retrofit. And so really it's there. So the very first point is to strengthen the protection of homes and the occupants' health against poor quality retrofit and its unintended consequences. So that is one of the main reasons that we have PAS 2035, is to avoid these unintended consequences like condensation, damp and mould, and high energy bills, for example, and the list goes on. So that's really important. It's always in the back of the retrofit steering task group's minds, everyone's minds, when they're thinking about these updates. The next one was to look more at whole dwelling retrofit in planned stages, so to strengthen that focus. So that was another recommendation that came out of the Each Home Counts review, this idea that we don't just go in and do a retrofit because there happens to be some funding in that particular area, but we need to think about what's right for that building and how it's going to look when it's finished in 2030, 2040, 2050, so that we're making sure that we plan our retrofit using a whole dwelling approach, which doesn't mean you do it all in one go. It just means you're thinking about the whole building. They also wanted to strengthen the role of PAS 2035 in terms of our climate targets, so moving towards the national net zero carbon standard. Obviously, retrofit's a really important part of that, so that needed to go into update. To improve the applicability of PASs to scale retrofit. So we're seeing quite a lot of social housing, large-scale retrofits going on, and the current PAS 2035 doesn't talk a lot about that. There is bits of guidance in there, but we wanted to improve the focus on different dwelling types using archetypes, for example. I'll talk a bit more about that later. There's also a bit more focus on the idea that you might have a main contractor rather than just a retrofit installer. If you're doing large-scale retrofit, you might be doing multiple measures, for example. And then we've got thinking about the devolved administration, so Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, England, and all of their specific requirements and their specific building regulations, making sure that PAS 2035 is appropriate to their retrofit programmes. And then finally correcting technical errors and inconsistencies in PAS 2035. So that's sort of the brief from the retrofit steering task group, and I'm going to go through as many of the changes as I can today, some of them in more detail than others because some of them are a bit more meaty, if you like. So these ones I'm just going to briefly mention because they're not massively controversial changes. They shouldn't have a big impact on everybody, but it's important to know that they're there. So as I've mentioned before, if we start from left-hand side, we have updated PAS 2035 to reflect national policy. So more of an emphasis on the role of PAS 2035 in protecting the consumer as well. I've talked about those two things already. Then the next one is the BEIS Retrofit Technical Guide. So they've published a number of guides now on internal wall insulation, room in the roof insulation, solid floor and suspended floor insulation. So they've just been included as references because they weren't referenced before in PAS 2035. The third one, as I've mentioned, is around referencing the main contractor a bit more. Now, there's no additional requirements for a main contractor. It's just recognising that some of the things that the retrofit installer has to do under PAS 2035 might actually be done by a main contractor instead. So retrofit installer is still the key sort of player for PAS 2030. You know, they're still the ones that are certified under PAS 2030, but you may have this main contractor who's employing perhaps several retrofit installers as well. And then the last one on here is that the contents of a medium-term improvement plan used to be in the guidance section, even though it was referenced from a normative section, so normative being a requirement. We've basically put that contents into the required section, so a normative section rather than guidance. So that's clause 5.2.3. which was a guidance section, and it's now normative in 8.1.7. Okay, so there's no changes there really. It's just moved. And then these three, again, quite light changes. So we've got a process now where you can have a boiler replacement. So your boiler's broken down, you need to replace it pretty quickly. You haven't got time to get a retrofit coordinator on board and try and get all the PAS compliance, retrofit assessment, etc. What this does is a few clauses in here, and it basically says that you can replace that boiler, but then you can come back, get a retrofit coordinator, do a full retrofit assessment, improvement options evaluation, medium-term improvement plan. So follow that PAS 2035 process after you've replaced that boiler, so it doesn't delay the need for, you know, if you're in the middle of winter and you need that replacement boiler, it won't delay that installation, but you can still therefore be compliant with PAS 2035. The middle one there around climate resilience and adaptation. So this is actually on our update list for every amendment now going forward, because our climate's always changing. We're never quite sure in which direction, but we can see trends that our buildings need to be more resilient, perhaps to flood, for example, and they need to adapt basically. And when we're retrofitting, we need to make sure that we're not making it any worse for climate change adaptation and ideally improving things. So we've got improved guidance and requirements for climate resilience and adaptation in retrofit. And then the last one on the right is requirements and guidance around moisture in buildings. So we've got a new British standard in management of moisture in buildings, BS 5250. I say new, it's an updated version of an existing standard. And there's been quite a lot of changes in that, particularly around the language around moisture in buildings. So we talk more about management of moisture risks, rather than specific problems like interstitial condensation, which in itself might not be a problem if you've managed the moisture well. So there's those changes. So you can see there's quite a lot. And then we've got 8 further changes, which I'm going to go to in a bit more detail. So these have at least a slide each, okay, to explain them a bit further. And apologies for the different topics. I mean, I really am scooting all over the place with this, but this is just where we got to with these changes. So the first one is around air tightness strategy. Now, what we have currently in PAS 2035 is that you need to do air tightness testing for Path C, which includes those properties and conservation areas. Doesn't always make a lot of sense. So what we've said now is that if you're installing energy efficiency measures that improve the building fabric, so that's things like insulation, air tightness, replacement windows, then you need to have an air tightness and air leakage testing strategy as part of the retrofit design. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to set an air tightness target, doesn't necessarily mean you have to test, it just means you have to have a strategy. There's a fair bit of guidance in there about what you would include in a strategy. It may be as simple as just saying what is forming the air barrier and how you're going to seal the windows to the walls, or whatever it happens to be that you're doing, how you're going to achieve that air tightness. But you may want to set an air tightness target if you're putting in quite a lot of different fabric measures. If you do set an air tightness target, then you have to test. So you have to demonstrate compliance with that air tightness standard if you set one in your air tightness strategy. We've also got reference to the new CIBSE guidance on air tightness testing, which means that you can use a pulse test for that compliance now as well, in line with building regulations. Okay, we're going to skip ahead to further monitoring and evaluation now. So you may know that we've got basic evaluation and intermediate and advanced evaluation. So we've still got basic. Basic is the same as it is now. Intermediate and advanced monitoring and evaluation happens if you find something wrong in the basic evaluation. And we've now called that further evaluation. And that essentially references our new British standards. That is a new standard, BS 40101 in monitoring and evaluation. And it recognises that if you do find something wrong, you're probably going to get an independent third party to come in and define what further monitoring you need in order to find out what the problem is. The other change is that we've put a requirement in for monitoring and evaluation plan to be prepared as part of the medium-term improvement plan. So when you start a retrofit project under PAS 2035, you have to agree some intended outcomes with the client. And at the end of the project, you test whether you've met those intended outcomes. And that's the point of the monitoring and evaluation, as well as being able to learn from any problems in retrofit. So therefore, when you set your intended outcomes at the start of the project, you also need to have a plan about how you're going to evaluate those intended outcomes at the end of the project. So that's all that's saying, is let's just write down how we're going to prove whether we've met those intended outcomes and to learn from any of the problems that we might have during that retrofit. Okay, skipping again to scale retrofit. Now, I mentioned this earlier. The PAS 2035 process is quite linear. It's sort of the way it reads is you do a retrofit assessment, you then do your improvement options evaluation, your medium-term improvement plan, then your retrofit design, etc., etc. We recognise that that's quite tricky for scale retrofit. Now, whilst it doesn't prohibit you starting on your retrofit design based on archetypes, it doesn't explicitly say it. So what we've said is that you can start your retrofit design based on an archetype assessment. So if you've got many properties that are the same, maybe they're on the same estate, maybe they're in the same tower block, then you can start your retrofit design based on archetypes that you can get into. You then create your archetype improvement options evaluation, your archetype medium-term improvement plan, and your archetype retrofit design. As you're progressing through that process, you will be trying to get dwelling assessments of all of the other dwellings, because you need to get into every dwelling before you start retrofitting it. So it just prevents the delay of the retrofit design process. So by the end of the retrofit design process, you should have individual dwelling assessments, individual improvement options evaluations, and individual medium-term improvement plans. Maybe you present an archetype improvement options evaluation, but then you report by exception for those dwellings that you found that are slightly different from that archetype. So rather than, loads and loads of paperwork and repeating everything again and again, you could produce a compiled report which says, this is our archetype, these dwellings have these differences. Okay, obviously that's a big change in the systems that we've got at the moment. So we'll have to see how that progresses. And then obviously you go on to the installation once you've finished your retrofit design and you've managed to get into every building and done that assessment. Right, this is a big one, removal of the risk pathways. It has been an all-encompassing change, and the reason it was done is partly to simplify the process, so to make it much more clear. what was going on in PAS 2035, but also to remove some of those consequences of having risk pathways that meant that we had certain things that didn't quite make sense. For example, air tightness testing every building in a conservation area, even if you're just replacing a door, that kind of thing. So if we start with retrofit assessments, so on the left we've got what we've got at the moment, path A, B and C, and then on the right is what we've got in the amended version, in the revision. So path A was a basic building assessment, and then path B builds on path A, but you've got more details to create your RDSAT, your energy model. So you're taking measurements as well. And then path C, you've got the same as path B, but you've got a RICS level 3 assessment, air tightness testing, and any other appropriate testing that you need. So we plumped for the middle ground because there's now a requirement to do improvement options evaluation for every retrofit, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we've got path B, so collecting all of that basic building assessment and details to create an energy model, but air tightness testing is no longer normative as part of the assessment. So that comes back to your air tightness testing strategy that I talked about earlier. So the retrofit design process, we had 3 paths. That path A was pretty much a complete and detailed design for the measures. Path B would have improvement option evaluation, medium-term improvement plan, and your heritage significant assessment and your ventilation assessment. And then path C would have the same as path B, but you've got protected buildings. You've got to do full heritage significance assessment in line with BS 7913, and you've got air tightness targets and post-testing. We've got most of those things in the current version, but they are just written to make a little bit more sense. So you do have to do improvement options evaluation and medium-term improvement plan for every project now. But you do a heritage significant assessment if it's a traditional building. You do a ventilation assessment and upgrade if you're installing measures that are impacting upon ventilation or air tightness. You do the heritage significant assessments if it's a protected building and you found that there's some significance in the retrofit assessment. And you have an air tightness strategy for some projects, which I've talked about before. Retrofit advice. So this is probably the simplest one. So we have in path A, we have 3 stages at which you give retrofit advice, which is at the start of the project, when you finish the retrofit design, and when you hand over the project. Path B, because you've got that improvement options evaluation, you also have advice at that stage as well. And then path C was the same. So because we've got an improvement options evaluation for every project, we now have advice at 4 stages. So at the start, when you've done the improvement options evaluation, when you've done the design, and then at handover. And the requirements for each of those stages are the same for retrofit advice. Qualifications. So we'll start with the simple ones and then we'll go on to retrofit design. So currently at the top table shows what we've got at the moment with path A, B and C, and we've got the retrofit assessor in there and the retrofit coordinator. So the retrofit assessor could be a domestic energy assessor, or for path A, you could also be a retrofit coordinator, which is signified by that purple kind of organogram. So if you see that symbol, that means it's a level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and risk management. For traditional buildings, you can be a domestic energy assessor and you need to have a level 3 award in retrofit of traditional buildings, which is the yellow castle symbol. Okay. And what we've got now is very similar, except that we're not allowing a retrofit coordinator to do that assessment because they're not trained in retrofit assessment, essentially. So we've got a domestic energy assessor doing assessments for all buildings. And then if traditional buildings, they need to have that level 3 award. And the retrofit coordinator qualifications very similar. So all we're doing is adding an additional requirement that if you're dealing with traditional buildings, you also have that level 3 award in energy efficiency and retrofit of traditional buildings. Retrofit designer. Okay, I've tried to symbolize some of this so that you can hopefully see the patterns a bit clearer, but it is complicated. So if we start on the left-hand side table and look at what we've got now. So for Path A, we have the retrofit designer could be a retrofit coordinator or a chartered architectural technologist or a specialist designer of a system or a measure, which is that blue sort of symbol at the bottom there with a pencil. So that's a specialist designer of a single measure or a single system, or somebody who's been approved by manufacturer or for gas installations, or someone who's MCS certified or chartered building services engineer. So that's the definition of your sort of single measure designer qualifications, if you like. The green hat for Path B is your architect, surveyor, Chartered Institute of Building member, so sort of professional qualifications, if you like, and then, or they could be a retrofit coordinator, could be designing at Path B. Path C is your professional qualifications and retrofit coordination diploma. Traditional buildings, again, you see this level 3 award crop up again, but actually if you're in Path C, then you have to be a member of a building conservation scheme of one of these sort of chartered institutes, which is quite onerous. So we've changed that a little bit. So if we go to what we've got now, we're now talking about numbers of measures. Okay, so if we have a single measure, you could be a professional, one of these guys down here, or a single measure designer, so a specialist designer of a measure or a system, as per before. If you've got two interacting fabric measures, so that means they join at the edges or junctions or corners, then you need to be a professional, or we have this new sort of set of qualifications, which is similar to the single measure designer. But if you're a specialist designer or specifier of a measure, then it needs to be under an agreement certified scheme. A specialist designer or specifier of a system, then you need to be part of an industry quality assurance scheme. So there's just that extra level of assurance in there for that specialised designer if you're dealing with two interacting fabric measures. If you're dealing with two or more non-interacting measures, so you've got a boiler and windows, for example, they're not interacting with each other, they don't join, then you can be a retrofit coordinator as well as your professional qualifications, so either or. If you're dealing with any number of measures on a system build, any number of measures on a high rise, or greater than 2 fabric measures on any type of building, then you need to have those professional qualifications. And then finally, if it's a traditional building, then you have to be a professional and have this level 3 award in energy efficiency, or you could have that membership of the building conservation scheme. Right, so that was the difficult bit. Hopefully it'll be a bit simpler now. We're going to talk a bit about the retrofit coordinator role. So we know that the role of the retrofit coordinator is to protect the client's interest and the public's interest. So we've just added a couple more words in there that say what they should do about it. So they need to identify what those clients' interests and public's interests are and document them, basically. And then we've got a few more clauses around site inspections. Now, the role of the retrofit coordinator is to ensure compliance with PAS 2035. So the idea is that they need to see the install. They need to collect evidence in person, ideally, that that measure has been installed. But for certain measures, and there's a list in the revision, which I'm not going to read out now because it's quite long, then the evidence could be collected by a third party. So it could be collected by the contractor and given to the retrofit coordinator. And that evidence is in the form of written records and photographic evidence of the measure being installed. We've also got a new clause in there, 9.3.2, which talks about what the retrofit coordinator should do if they find a non-compliance with PAS 2035, whether that's on site or at any other stage in the PAS 2035 process. They should report that to the retrofit installer and to the client, ideally. Okay, we're getting to the annexes now. Annex E, historic significance. This has been quite a long time coming. So we currently have a simplified historic significance assessment based on BS 7913, which is being used in PAS 2035 processes. And we've just brought that into Annex E. So that's what Annex E is. So for all traditional buildings, you need to do this simplified BS 7913, which is now in Annex E. And that was a requirement before anyway, so that's not changed. It's just we've brought it into PAS 2035 now. The result, we've got a couple of extra clauses that tell you what to do if you find significance. So we've got, if you find significance in the initial assessment, then you need to consider that when you're selecting the measures. And then if you find that your measures are likely to have an impact on that significance, then you need to do a full BS 7913 heritage impact assessment. Okay, so just got a couple of triggers there about what you should do when you find significance. Right, Annex C is our ventilation annex. And this used to come into play for all retrofits. Now it's only triggered if you're installing measures that are going to fairly significantly improve your air tightness. So we now have a nice table in approved document F, and they categorize the energy efficiency measures as to how much impact they're going to have on infiltration or air tightness of the building. So what we're saying is if you've got measures installed that are category B or C, as defined in ADF, then you need to determine the adequacy of ventilation and follow Annex C. Otherwise, you don't. Or if there's condensation or mold growth found in the retrofit assessment, then you need to really have a look at the adequacy of the ventilation system. The other changes are around acceptable ventilation systems. So we just have a couple on the list now, which is continuous MEV or mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. You can have other systems as long as they extract moisture at source and you've got an expert giving you advice on the design of those systems. Right, now we're on to PAS 2030. So there's not many changes in PAS 2030 at all, but this is one of the big ones, I suppose. Every building has to have a pre-installation building inspection by the retrofit installer. There is a requirement currently to undertake independent inspections of that pre-installation building inspection. So an inspection of an inspection. It's only a proportion of those PIBs, pre-installation building inspections, that's required to be inspected, but that is there for cavity wall insulation currently. What we've done is we've extended that requirement of having those independent inspections for all insulation annexes by an appropriately qualified person, which is defined in PAS 2030. Or you could follow a recognised pre-notification process, and that's defined by an industry quality assurance scheme for your particular insulation that you're installing. So there's two routes now, rather than just the one. Finally, I'm going to finish on transition. I'm going to give you very black and white answers because I'm technical author of PAS 2035. I know a lot about the contents of PAS 2035, but I'm not involved in transition periods, how long it's going to take Trustmark to bring this in. So what I will say is that PAS 2035, PAS 2030 is going to be withdrawn on the 30th of March 2025. And then obviously we've got Wave 2.2 coming out, which says that all projects must be compliant with the updated PAS 2035-2023. And that is everything. Whistle stop tour. Thank you very much.